Forget the myths of polished armor shining in the sun and noble duels fought with honor. The real battlefield of the Middle Ages was violent, unforgiving, and drenched in blood. Medieval knights weren't just warriors. They were brutal survivors trained to dominate and destroy using weapons designed not for elegance, but for absolute effectiveness. When the clash of steel echoed across the field, it wasn't just about strength or courage, it was about what you had in your hands. From crushing maces to devastating polearms, some weapons were so vicious, they left nothing but broken bodies and shattered armor behind. These weren't symbols of glory. They were tools of war, forged in fire and used without mercy. Today, we're diving into 10 of the most brutal weapons medieval knights actually fought with, and why they were terrifyingly good at what they did. Number 1. Morningstar Mayhem. When you think about weapons built purely to brutalize the enemy, the morningstar stands in a league of its own. It wasn't crafted for elegance or ceremony, it existed to crush, rip, and disable. Unlike swords or spears that needed edge alignment or penetration angles, the morningstar was the kind of weapon that didn't care if you were in full plate armor or hiding behind a shield. Its spiked, heavy metal head did damage no matter what, transferring raw, concussive force with every swing. Those spikes weren't just for show. They focused the impact into tiny points, making it far more likely to crack helmets, tear mail links, or break collarbones even if the armor itself held up. The very structure of the weapon was unforgiving. A solid shaft, usually wooden but reinforced with iron bands, connected to a steel or iron ball covered in sharp, evenly spaced spikes. There were multiple types of morningstars in use. Infantrymen often carried longer versions that could keep enemies at bay, while mounted knights preferred shorter-handled variants that were easier to control from horseback. Both versions had one thing in common: they were all about raw impact. In actual combat, you didn't need to be particularly skilled to use a morningstar effectively. Swing with enough force, and your opponent was going down, either with broken ribs or a dented helm that would knock them out cold. But skilled fighters still trained with it to increase precision, especially when aiming for weak points in armor, like joints, armpits, and the sides of the helmet. What's fascinating is how effective the morningstar remained across different battlefield roles. During sieges, it could be used to smash through wooden barricades or batter defenders on walls. In close quarter fights, where swords could get tangled or spears were too long to wield properly, the morningstar had no such issue. You didn't have to worry about finesse, only power and timing. When a knight with a morningstar moved through a breach in a castle wall or pushed into a crowded melee, they became a wrecking force. The weapon was chaotic and wild, swinging with enough speed and torque to make defenders flinch or step back. Exactly the opening a seasoned warrior needed. There was also a psychological factor. Just seeing a morningstar, spikes gleaming, head still stained from earlier blows, could rattle morale. It wasn't a noble weapon. It didn't suggest chivalry. It suggested pain, and the kind of death that wasn't quick or clean. In the brutal, up-close fights of the medieval period, that intimidation mattered. No one wanted to be on the receiving end of something designed not just to kill, but to maim and traumatize. The morningstar sent a clear message. This wasn't going to be a duel. It was going to be a beating. What also made it unique among knightly weapons was its resistance to counterattack. As plate armor improved, many traditional weapons lost effectiveness. A sword might glance off a cuirass. A spear might get stuck. But the morningstar simply evolved alongside. Its head became heavier. The spikes longer, sometimes hooked or barbed. Some versions even added flanges to deliver more focused blows. Armor could slow the damage, but it couldn't stop the sheer physics of a spiked ball driven by trained arms into a skull. And this was a weapon of momentum. You didn't need rapid strikes. One well-placed blow was usually enough. That's why many knights carried it not as a primary weapon, but as the finisher, the backup when things got ugly and fast. In the thick of battle, when formations collapsed and the lines blurred, the morningstar became a personal statement of violence. It was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of how medieval warfare really worked, up close, brutal, and indifferent to ideals of glory or fairness. Just raw, effective devastation, swung in arcs of chaos. Number 2, Warhammer Wreckage. By the late Middle Ages, plate armor had evolved into a near impenetrable shell, rendering most cutting weapons ineffective unless they found the rare exposed joint or managed a lucky blow. That's where the Warhammer stepped in, not as a refinement, but as a cold answer to the rising dominance of steel. Unlike a sword that relied on slashing or stabbing, the Warhammer was designed to concentrate force in a small, solid area, either flattening armor or piercing straight through it. It was the medieval equivalent of a precision wrecking tool, forged specifically for combat against armored foes, especially other knights. A warhammer in trained hands didn't just aim to kill, it was made to disable instantly, breaking ribs, crushing helmets, or shattering the bones beneath protective layers. Its design was both brutal and calculated. One end usually featured a blunt hammer face to dent and deform armor, while the opposite side often carried a spike or beak. narrow and curved, meant to penetrate steel and exploit gaps at the shoulders, neck, and visor. Some versions included a small hook or claw, giving the wielder the ability to drag enemies from horseback or manipulate their position mid-fight. The length of the haft varied, with shorter ones used for one-handed strikes in confined melee, and longer polehammer variants employed for extended reach and greater momentum. In the chaos of battlefield engagements, especially in tightly packed formations or narrow breaches, the warhammer thrived. Knights weren't always galloping around in joust-like conditions. Many real clashes happened shoulder to shoulder, in mud, smoke, and confusion. In those moments, the precision and ferocity of the warhammer made it a weapon of choice, capable of turning the tide with a single well-placed blow. It was less about showmanship and more about absolute efficiency. When armor became the standard, the warhammer answered with a clear and deadly logic. Number 3. Flail Frenzy. Among the more unpredictable and chaotic weapons used by medieval knights, the flail stands out not just for its unusual construction, but for the way it changed the rhythm of close combat. At first glance, it looked unstable, a wooden or metal shaft connected to one or more spiked balls through a short chain. But that very instability was its greatest strength. Where most weapons followed straight trajectories that could be blocked or parried, the flail bent around shields, slipped past sword guards, and struck from unexpected angles, forcing even seasoned fighters to constantly adjust their defense. Knights who mastered the flail weren't just strong, they needed precise timing, spatial awareness, and complete control of their movement, or else they risked injuring themselves with a poorly timed swing. The flail had a unique tactical edge in both foot combat and cavalry charges. When used by a mounted knight, its range and momentum were amplified by speed and elevation, delivering crushing force to helmets or shoulders before the enemy could respond. Infantry wielding it in tight formations could disrupt enemy shield walls or disorient opponents in duels, especially by exploiting the flail's ability to strike over or around obstacles. In a siege scenario, where corridors and battlements limited motion, the flail could become a nightmare in confined quarters, its unpredictable arcs creating gaps in defensive lines or breaking through helmet crests with terrifying speed. Unlike swords or axes that required clean contact, the flail used rotational velocity to make up for imperfect hits. Even glancing blows could cause fractures or concussive trauma, particularly when spikes bit into flesh through mail or thinner armor sections. The weapon punished hesitation, both in its user and in its target. Once it began its swing, the energy had to be followed through, meaning the wielder had to commit fully, reading the opponent's movement and striking at the moment their guard was broken or distracted. Training with the flail wasn't widespread among all soldiers, it demanded discipline and was difficult to master without rigorous practice. But in the hands of a confident knight, it delivered not only brute force, but psychological intimidation. Watching a flail spin in the air, spikes catching the light, sent a message. This wasn't going to be a controlled or clean fight. It was going to be fast, violent, and unpredictable. And in the unforgiving environment of medieval warfare, that was often exactly what was needed. Number 4. Poleaxe Punishment. The poleaxe was not just a tool of war, it was a direct response to the evolution of knightly armor. As full plate became more advanced and resistant to cuts and stabs, the need for a weapon that could overwhelm such protection led to the rise of the poleaxe. What made it stand out among medieval weapons was its balanced fusion of offensive versatility and defensive control. This wasn't a primitive tool cobbled together, it was engineered for elite combat. Typically about 5 to 6 feet in length, the poleaxe was topped with a variety of brutal attachments, a heavy axe blade for cleaving, a hammer face or blunt side for crushing, and a top spike for thrusting into gaps in armor. Often, a back spike or beak was added to punch through helmets or pull an enemy off balance. Unlike simpler weapons, the poleaxe was designed with both reach and technique in mind. It allowed knights to keep their distance from opponents while still being able to deliver precise, punishing blows. In armored duels and battlefield encounters, especially when formations collapsed and close-quarter chaos erupted, the poleaxe offered the ability to adapt quickly, one moment using the axe head to target a limb, the next reversing into a hammer strike aimed at the chest or shoulder. The shaft itself could be used for tripping or parrying, giving it value even when the head wasn't in motion. Knights trained specifically with poleaxes in controlled sparring sessions, using half-sword techniques, grappling, and even disarming moves. It wasn't a brute's weapon, it demanded skill, discipline, and tactical awareness. In siege warfare or breach fighting, the poleaxe came into its own. Fighting up narrow stairwells or through broken walls required weapons that worked at mid-range and could both strike and hook. A knight using a poleaxe could knock an opponent to the ground, then finish the fight by thrusting the spike into a vulnerable joint or visor slit. And unlike flails or morningstars, the poleaxe allowed for control. It didn't rely on chaos, it brought method to brutality. Balanced, weighted, and carefully crafted, it symbolized how far battlefield weapons had come, no longer just about force, but about calculated destruction tailored for the armored battlefield of the late medieval period. Number 5. Mace Madness. The mace was never meant to be elegant. It was direct, brutal, and unpretentious, designed specifically for one thing: to crush anything in its path. Unlike blades that required precision or axes that relied on heavy swinging arcs, the mace was all about delivering raw force in close quarters. Its compact form made it reliable in tight combat, where space was limited and chaos reigned. The design was simple but devastating: a strong metal head, often flanged or knob-bed, mounted on a wooden or full metal shaft. This head was intentionally shaped to concentrate the kinetic energy of each strike, allowing it to dent, bend, or outright cave in even hardened plate armor. And it didn't need to cut, it only needed to land. What made the mace particularly feared among knights was its sheer consistency. No matter how advanced armor became, it couldn't completely neutralize the impact trauma that the mace delivered. A blow to the chest could knock the wind out of a man even through layers of padding and steel. A strike to the helm could disorient or concuss. In many ways, the mace bypassed the need to get through armor and simply punished whatever was underneath. This made it not only a practical battlefield tool, but also a psychological weapon. The knowledge that a knight might be crushed without ever being pierced added a distinct layer of dread. Its construction varied. Some maces were cast in one piece of iron, others combined hardwood and steel for lighter handling. Flanked versions had ridges that allowed more effective strikes against angled surfaces, reducing the chance of a glancing blow. Many knights favored the mace for its low maintenance: no edges to sharpen, no complex handling techniques to memorize. In a siege or a dense melee, where swordplay was messy and footwork restricted, the mace's straightforward use became a serious advantage. It didn't require finesse, but it rewarded aggression, and in the brutal world of medieval combat, that was often the edge between life and death. Number 6. Sword of War. The Sword of War, also known as the Great Sword or Long Sword in its various forms, was the answer to a changing battlefield where one-handed weapons were no longer enough to handle the scale or intensity of conflict. Unlike the more familiar arming sword, which was commonly worn at the hip for everyday defense or dueling, the Sword of War was a two-handed weapon, designed specifically for use on the battlefield. These swords were longer, heavier, and built to deal with both the armored knight and the shifting dynamics of late medieval warfare, where crowd control, reach, and brutal stopping power began to matter more than chivalric flair. The design of a Sword of War was far from ornamental. Its extended grip allowed for powerful two-handed swings, while the blade itself was crafted with versatility in mind. Some were straight and tapering, optimized for thrusting into the weak points of armor. Others featured broader blades capable of delivering cleaving strikes that could knock an opponent off balance or batter shields and limbs with sheer force. The fuller, a central groove down the blade, was often used not only to lighten the weapon but to preserve rigidity during impact. A knight could use it to thrust, slash, or even half-sword, gripping the blade itself to guide the point precisely into gaps in an opponent's armor during close combat. Contrary to popular myths, these swords were not unwieldy or crude. Trained knights could use them with surprising speed and accuracy. In battle, the Sword of War served as both a primary weapon and a utility tool, effective in mounted charges, infantry engagements, or one-on-one combat. When formations broke or during siege breaches where space opened up, this sword offered superior control and reach, allowing its user to dominate the space around them. It wasn't just a weapon of power, but of precision, discipline, and tactical adaptability, a clear reflection of how knights themselves had to evolve as warfare became more brutal and less formal. Number 7. Halbert Hell. The halberd was never just a peasant's polearm, it was a knight's weapon of choice when precision and brute strength had to meet in one deadly package. As medieval warfare shifted from one-on-one duels to formation-based combat and organized infantry lines, knights needed tools that could handle the complexity of battlefield threats. The halberd delivered that in spades. At first glance, it looked like a hybrid, and that's exactly what it was. A long wooden shaft topped with an axe blade on one side, a hook or spike on the other, and a spear point extending from the top. Each element served a specific tactical purpose, making the halberd one of the most versatile and feared polearms of its time. The axe head was designed for powerful cleaving strikes. When swung with full force, it could split shields, tear into padded armor, or break through the less reinforced joints of a knight's plate. But what made it so effective wasn't just the slicing, it was what followed. If the axe didn't bring an enemy down, the rear hook could be used to pull a knight from horseback or snag a limb, shield, or weapon, destabilizing the opponent and creating an opening. And if close quarters made swinging difficult, the spear tip could be used for rapid thrusting, ideal for finding weak spots in plate armor, or for keeping multiple opponents at bay. What set the halberd apart from simpler pole arms like the spear or pike was how balanced it was in use. It wasn't just a thrusting tool or a hacking weapon, it was both, depending on the situation. Knights wielding halberds trained to transition between cutting, hooking, and stabbing in fluid motion. It was a weapon that demanded understanding of timing and distance, rewarding fighters who could read the flow of battle and punish hesitation. During sieges or narrow encounters in breached walls, the halberd gave an armored soldier range, power, and technical control, all in one brutal silhouette. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't have to be. It just had to dominate. And it did. Number 8. Crossbow carnage. While most people imagine knights in shining armor charging with lances or clashing swords, the reality of medieval warfare was far more layered, and one of the most disruptive elements on the battlefield wasn't a blade at all, but the crossbow. Often underestimated in modern depictions, the crossbow changed the dynamics of combat in a way few weapons did. Unlike the longbow, which required years of training and exceptional physical conditioning, the crossbow could be wielded effectively by someone with only weeks of instruction. And yet, despite that accessibility, it packed a terrifying punch, strong enough to punch through mail and even plate armor at medium range. Its design was deceptively simple: a horizontal bow mounted on a stock with a mechanism, often a trigger or rotating nut, to release the string. What made it so deadly was the high draw weight, sometimes exceeding 1,000 pounds of force in large steel crossbows. That power didn't come easily. Loading it required tools like a goat's foot lever or windlass, which made reload times slower than traditional bows. But knights weren't using it for rapid fire. They were using it for precision, armor-piercing power. A single well-aimed shot could disable a mounted opponent, penetrate the visor of a helm, or punch through the armpit where armor was weakest. On the battlefield, crossbows served a range of roles. From castle walls, defenders used them to pick off advancing troops. In sieges, attackers positioned crossbowmen behind pavises, large shields set into the ground, to fire safely and steadily into defending ranks. Even knights, despite the weapon's initial association with mercenaries and infantry, began to recognize its value, especially during siege warfare and defensive engagements. Custom bolts, heavier quarrels, and reinforced stocks made knightly crossbows deadlier and more durable. It wasn't a weapon of glory. It was a weapon of certainty. When aimed well, it didn't leave much to chance. And in a world where armor was getting stronger by the year, the crossbow proved that distance didn't mean safety. It meant opportunity. Number 9. Dagger duels. When we picture medieval knights, our minds usually leap to swords, lances, and thundering cavalry charges. But one of the most personal and chilling weapons in a knight's arsenal was the dagger. Specifically, the rondel dagger, crafted not as a sidearm of last resort, but as a deliberate tool for finishing an opponent up close. Unlike broader-bladed daggers or ceremonial knives, the rondel was narrow, stiff, and designed to pierce, not slash. It featured a strong, tapered point and a robust grip, often flanked by disc-shaped guards, allowing the user to drive it with full force into gaps in armor or between joints with lethal accuracy. Knights carried these daggers into battle not as ornaments, but as extensions of their combat strategy. In the chaos of melee, when weapons were locked, shields shattered, and enemies wrestled in the mud, daggers became the natural fallback. If a knight was brought to the ground or found himself grappling with an opponent, the fight turned into a deadly wrestling match where the first to draw their dagger often walked away alive. And this wasn't theatrical, it was calculated. Combat manuals from the period showed detailed instructions on how to hold the dagger in an ice pick grip, how to aim for the armpit, the throat, the base of the skull, any exposed point where armor ended or could be forced aside. Daggers also played a grim role in mercy killing. On the battlefield, a knight might deliver a final blow to a mortally wounded foe to spare them prolonged suffering, or simply to end the threat. In sieges and urban fighting, where combat was tight and brutal, the dagger allowed a soldier to fight effectively even in cramped stairwells or crowded breaches. And in duels fought in full armor, daggers weren't backup. They were the endgame. Once swords locked or fell away, the fighters closed in, using grappling and balance to deliver a finishing stab. What makes the rondel dagger stand out isn't just how it was used, but the mindset behind it. It required proximity, calm under pressure, and intimate understanding of the human body's weaknesses. There was no spectacle, no sweeping cuts, only precision, control, and a brutal kind of efficiency that defined the darkest edges of medieval warfare. Number 10. Siege swordplay. Siege warfare was the ultimate test of a knight's adaptability, not only of his endurance and tactics, but of his weaponry as well. In this brutal setting, where the narrow spiral of a stone stairwell or the chaos of a broken battlement could become your battlefield, the weapons used had to meet the demands of close quarters, unpredictable angles, and sheer survival. Enter siege swordplay, an entire set of techniques and tools adapted specifically for urban or fortress combat, where long polearms were too clumsy and battlefield etiquette meant nothing. And at the center of this was the short sword, or hand-and-a-half bastard sword, prized for its versatility and control in tight conditions. These were not the long, sweeping greatswords seen in open cavalry engagements. They were compact, balanced and forged for environments where every movement had to count. Whether clearing a breach, pushing up a ladder under a rain of arrows, or turning a corner into a torch-lit hallway, the knight needed a weapon that could deliver lethal force without overextending. The siege sword provided just that, a tool that allowed for cutting, stabbing, grappling, and even half-sword techniques, where the knight would grip his own blade with a gauntleted hand to guide the tip into vulnerable gaps in armor at close range. What made this type of combat especially unforgiving was the reduced visibility, the proximity of the enemy, and the terrain itself, uneven floors, falling debris, narrow entries. Knights learned to use their environment. They'd slam opponents into walls, use the crossguard as a striking tool, or reverse their grip entirely to use the pommel like a hammer. In those moments, the sword was not a symbol of honor, but a multi-tool of survival. There was no space for grand gestures, only for calculated violence. And that violence was relentless. Once inside a besieged structure, defenders and attackers often fought hand-to-hand in confined towers, tunnels, or breaches. With shields splintered and long weapons discarded, the sword became a tool not just of offense, but of control, holding ground, forcing retreats, or silencing resistance in a corner where backup was minutes away. It was this adaptability, this harsh practicality, that defined siege swordplay. Not flashy, not clean, just brutally effective in the most punishing spaces of medieval war.